The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 14th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the gospel of our Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Our gospel this morning shows up in 3 places in our Bible. This version from Matthew 14, but also in Mark 6 and the 6th chapter of John. In all 3 cases, this story follows directly on the heels of the feeding of the 5,000 with the loaves and fishes. The Matthew version is the only one where Peter tells Jesus to call him out to walk on the water to him. Let's back up a bit first. At the beginning of our reading today, Jesus told the disciples to go on ahead of him while he dismissed the crowd. He then went up onto the mountainside by himself to pray. If you recall the previous event, Jesus was probably tired, having likely preached, taught, and healed all day. He needed a break, and that's not even counting feeding 5,000 people. We've all had days like that, haven't we? The days that are just one thing after another with no time to take a deep breath or gather your thoughts. Not a moment to yourself. Maybe at the end of such a day, you just want to go to some quiet place to clear your mind and your heart. It might be your patio, your garden, your bedroom, or a sunroom. You need to recharge and reconnect with yourself and reconnect with God. So Jesus sent the guys off ahead of him so we could have some time alone. And by sending them off by boat, maybe it ensured that they wouldn't be back to bother him with that one last thing. Anyway, it seemed that they didn't get far because of strong winds, because they were still on the water when dawn broke. Jesus walked out to meet them on the water. The disciples thought it was a ghost and were afraid. Now you might think that with everything they had seen Jesus do with their own eyes, seeing Jesus coming to them walking on the water might be within the realm of possibility. He had healed sick people, cast out demons, raised the young girl from the dead that we heard about last week, given people back their sight and their hearing, and he had just fed 5,000 hungry people with a young boy's lunch. But they didn't recognize him until he told them who he was and to not be afraid. Then guess who pipes up? Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." What on earth was Peter thinking? It figures that it was Peter, right? Throughout the Gospels, it seems that Peter was always the one who spoke before fully thinking things through. But how often don't we find ourselves in Peter's sandals? He says things without thinking. His mouth gets him into places where his courage doesn't keep him. He loves Jesus, but he has doubts. He falls short. He is human. Sounds a lot like most of us, doesn't it? So Peter stepped out of the boat, walked toward Jesus, but became afraid and started to sink when he noticed the wind. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus reached out, grabbed him, and brought him back into the boat. Jesus then basically said to him, "You silly man, did you really think I'd let you fall?" We have to remember that the water wasn't calm when Peter challenged Jesus to call him out onto the water. It was just as windy when Peter made his move to get out of the boat as when he noticed the wind, became afraid, and started to sink. There is much for us to learn in this gospel reading for today. How often don't we find ourselves in stormy waters, prompting us to call out to Jesus for reassurance of his presence? Jesus tells us always, "I'm right here. Just come to me." We might take those first steps toward Jesus' embrace and security, but sometimes the uncertainty of the unknown path with Jesus drives us back into the storm we already know, no matter how difficult or joyless it might be. Peter was pretty safe in the boat. Sure, it was windy and they weren't making any headway, but it was safe. The boat was solid. It had a floor which kept him from sinking to the bottom of the lake, but his fellow disciples were, forgive the pun, in the same boat. But Peter wanted to prove his faith and his belief, so he follows Jesus' call into uncharted territory. He actually took the bold step. He was really incredibly brave to throw his legs over the side and step onto the water. Yes, he got scared, but we do too, don't we? Sometimes following Jesus requires us to make moves and do things we might not do otherwise. But when we step out in faith, Jesus is always, always there to catch us. Peter got wet. When he stepped out of the boat, Peter got wet. In fact, when he realized what was actually happening with the wind and the waves, he started to sink into the water, and he got really wet. We get wet too. When we follow Jesus, it might be a bumpy road. It might not be easy. In fact, we are told that earlier in Matthew 7. The Message translation puts it this way: "Don't look for shortcuts to God. The market is flooded with surefire, easygoing formulas for a successful life that can be practiced in your spare time. Don't fall for that stuff, even though the crowds of people do. The way to life, to God, is vigorous and requires total attention." But if we're going to follow Jesus, we have to take that first step. We can't do it from the safety of the boat. Here in our congregation, we are trying to discern the best way to be better neighbors, better disciples, better followers of Jesus. We must be the hands and feet of Jesus in our community. In order to do that, we will need to step out of our comfort zone. We cannot do it from our perch in our favorite pew. We must throw open our doors and take the first bold step outside. We must have faith that even if the road is bumpy, if we make mistakes, have faltering footsteps, risk giving in to our fears, that Jesus is there with an outstretched hand to keep us from sinking to the bottom. It doesn't mean we won't get wet. Jesus never promised Peter he wouldn't get wet, and we are made no such rosy promises either. One of my favorite Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. quotes goes, "Take the first step in faith. You don't have to see the whole staircase. Just take the first step." In our congregation, as we navigate what our mission will look like as we seek ways to redevelop our property, we will no doubt make mistakes, have uncertainty, and have fears about whether or not what we are doing is right. None of us can see the future. But as the song goes, "I know not what the future holds, but I know who holds the future." As we discern what our next moves are in the redevelopment process, your prayers, your faith, your willingness to step out of the boat and get wet is needed. We can't do it without you. In our gospel, Jesus came to the disciples walking on water. To be sure, they had never seen Jesus do that before. It's no different today. Jesus will present himself to us in ways we don't expect or maybe won't even recognize. We must rely on our faith and the outstretched hand of Jesus waiting to grab onto us and bring us safely to him. We can also apply our gospel today to our current situation. COVID-19 has really done a number on us in ways no one could have predicted. 6 months ago, if you had said what our lives would look like through April, May, June, July, and now into August, I can't imagine anyone would have believed you. I sure wouldn't have bet my next paycheck on that vision of our collective future. And yet, here we are, out of the boat and getting wet. But as always, Jesus is there with an outstretched hand, grabbing onto us. Various disciples here at St. Peter's are working diligently to find the safest ways for us to return to in-person worship this fall. It might be early September, but we won't know for a bit yet. It will probably be in small groups with a very different worship format for a while, but we don't know what that will look like yet either. These disciples are out of the boat and are aware of the wind swirling around them. We want everyone to return to our worship space safely, but there is much work to do to make that possible. Every precaution we can take to make that happen takes care and effort. It's a huge job, and there are many factors in play. They can't do this alone. Jesus is there, of course, but your prayers, your faith, and your willingness to step out of the boat with them and get wet is needed. We can't do it without you. Matthew's version of this story is a gift to us. The Mark and John versions, as I said at the beginning, don't have Peter stepping out of the boat. I think this added part of the story teaches us such a valuable lesson. I see 3 things come to the forefront of this story: feet, faith, and hands. Peter, as bold and brash as he was, had faith that if Jesus called him to come out onto the water, that he could indeed walk on top of the water. Peter then had to take that first step. He put his legs over the side and put his feet to the surface of the water and took those first steps. When he was overcome by fear of the wind and the waves, Jesus reached out his hand and grabbed Peter's hand. Yes, Peter got wet and he gave in to his fears, but he wasn't wrong to take those steps in faith. Whether you have a big decision to make, whether you have received a bad or uncertain medical diagnosis, whether you need to make better choices for a healthier lifestyle, whether you are trying to admit you need help to find a way out of addiction, just take one step out of the boat, and then another, and then another. Jesus is there waiting with an outstretched hand if you find yourself starting to doubt, or give in to your fears, or make a mistake. We don't know what any possible redevelopment will look like. The way ahead might be bumpy and uncertain, and the end result might not look like anything we envisioned when we started out. But we must take that first step, and then another, and then another. Our neighbors and our community need help. They need us. Jesus is always there with an outstretched hand if we find we are losing our way or are uncertain as to which fork in the road to take. We don't know what our worship or our worship space will look like as we begin to approach the light at the end of the COVID tunnel, whenever that happens. It will look and feel and sound very different than when we left the building on March 15th. We might have both in-person as well as online worship in our future, but we can still grow and learn and become better disciples. We must also allow each other the grace and the space to come back together in whichever way feels best for our own anxiety and comfort level. Are we willing to throw our legs over the side of the boat and take that first step, and then another, and then another? We need each other. We have missed each other. For those times when we are bound to feel anxious and afraid, when we see and feel the wind blowing around us, all we need to do is reach out our hand just like Peter did. Lord, save me. Jesus will be right there with an outstretched hand, waiting to pull us to safety. No matter how weak our faith, how faltering our feet, or how shaky our hands might be, Jesus is there, and he won't let us drown. Amen.